By the time the second harvest came in, the Vang family's rice paddies were the cleanest in Kitson County, and that was not a figure of speech. County Agricultural Inspector Diane Solberg walked the perimeter of all four paddies in the third week of September and found no standing pesticide application in the water, no visible snail damage on the tillers, and a yield per acre that she later described in her filed report as inconsistent with the inputs recorded. She had seen clean paddies before. She had not seen clean paddies that hadn't been treated, and she had not seen untreated paddies producing at this level on this soil in a wet year with a snail pressure as heavy as the one that had come through the county that summer. She stood at the edge of the third paddy for a long time with her clipboard against her chest, looking at the water and what moved through it, and then she made a note and moved on, because there was not a box on her form for what she was looking at. Bao Vang, watching from the far levee, did not say anything. His daughter Mia, standing next to him, had learned from him that there was a time to explain and a time to let a person see, and this was the second kind. You don't argue with ducks, her father had told her that spring when the money was already spent and the county was already talking. You just give them water and get out of the way. She had thought he meant it practically. By September, she understood he meant it as everything. That spring had been the second consecutive wet spring in the Red River Valley, and the golden apple snail population in Kitson County had reached a density that the County Extension Office described in its April bulletin as unprecedented in the modern cultivation record, which was a careful way of saying that nobody currently farming in the county had seen it this bad, and that the historical record of comparable infestations was not encouraging. Golden apple snails, introduced through the ornamental pond trade and established in the region's irrigation canals for the better part of a decade, ate rice at the seedling stage with a thoroughness that left paddies looking, as one farmer put it at the April growers meeting, like someone had come through with scissors. The conventional response was molluscicide application, specifically a copper sulfate compound that the county extension recommended at 2 to 3 pounds per acre at transplant and again at tillering depending on pressure. It worked insofar as it killed snails. It also killed the invertebrate populations in the paddy water, ran off into the drainage canals at levels that the State Environmental Office monitored with increasing interest, and cost, at current prices, somewhere between $60 and $90 per acre per application, depending on how much pressure warranted a second round. In a wet year, most of the Hmong rice farming families in the county budgeted for 2 applications. Some budgeted for 3. The Vang family, which had farmed 12 acres of paddy rice on leased ground north of Halleck for 7 years, had enough money in the account that March for 1 application and not quite enough for 2, which was not a crisis that announced itself clearly until Bao Vang sat down with the account book in late February and ran the numbers again and got the same result the second time that he had gotten the first. The Vang operation was not the largest in the county and was not the most established. Bao had come to Minnesota through the resettlement programs of the 1990s and had farmed rice on leased ground because leased ground was what he could access, and had built the operation across 15 years through a combination of specific skill and the kind of patience that is not temperamental, but tactical. The patience of someone who knows that the ground gives back what you put in and that the accounting is long. His daughter Mia was 26 and had grown up between the paddy and the county school system, and spoke English with the fluency of someone who had negotiated between 2 worlds since childhood, which meant she could read an agricultural bulletin and a seed catalog and a loan document with equal facility. And she could also read the paddy water the way her father had taught her, which was a different kind of reading and one that the County Extension Office had not developed a curriculum for. She had come back to the farm after 2 years at the Agricultural College in Crookston, where she had studied integrated pest management and written a thesis paper on biological control in aquatic farming systems that her advisor had praised and that no one in Kitson County had read. The combination of what Bao knew in his hands and what Mia knew from the literature was the particular strength of the operation, and it was also the thing that made the county's conventional wisdom look at them sideways, because it was not a combination that fit any established category of either traditional or modern farming. And categories are how a community decides what to trust. The ducks came from a hatchery in Moorhead and arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May. 500 khaki Campbell ducklings in ventilated cardboard boxes in the back of a rented cargo van, peeping with a volume and a unanimity that Mia later said was the most confident sound she had heard all spring, which was not a high bar, but was not nothing. Bao had heard about duck rice integration from his mother, who had farmed it in Laos before the war, and from a cousin in California who had tried a version of it in the Sacramento Valley in the 90s, with mixed results that were mixed for reasons the cousin could now identify but had not understood at the time. Mia had found 3 peer-reviewed papers on the system during her thesis research, 2 from Southeast Asian agricultural universities and 1 from a trial in Louisiana that had run for 4 seasons and produced yield data that she had converted to county comparable figures and run against the moluscicide cost model twice before showing it to her father. The math said the ducks could work. The math also said that the timing of introduction, the management of the duck cohort relative to the rice growth stage, and the stocking density relative to paddy acreage were all variables that the existing literature had not resolved cleanly, which meant the math was a projection and not a guarantee, and that the $2,500 they had spent on ducklings and fencing and modified water management infrastructure was money they did not have a second version of. Bao understood this. He had made decisions of this kind before, under conditions that made this one look comfortable, and he had the specific equanimity of someone for whom risk was not an abstraction, but a thing you calculated and then stopped calculating once the decision was made. The first person in the county to say something about the ducks at volume was a man named Curtis Prell, who farmed 200 acres of corn and soybeans north of the rice district, and who had strong opinions about agricultural practice in general and about the Hmong farming operations in particular, opinions that he delivered in the friendly, informative manner of someone who considers their views a public service. He stopped his truck on the county road beside the Vang paddies on a Saturday in mid-May, when the ducklings had been in the paddies for 4 days and were already moving through the shallows in the purposeful, slightly frantic way of young ducks discovering that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and he rolled down his window and called out to Mia, who was checking the corner fencing, that he didn't know if she was aware that those birds were going to eat her rice crop before the snails got a chance to, which was a concern he framed as helpfulness and which carried the specific weight of a man who has already decided the outcome and is offering the warning as a courtesy. Mia said the variety they had transplanted 3 weeks prior was past the stage at which ducks would damage it, and that the ducks were currently eating approximately 4 to 6 snails per bird per hour, based on her observation counts from that morning, which came to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 snails per hour across the paddy. Curtis Prell looked at her for a moment and then said that he hoped she knew what she was doing, which was not quite the same as saying she didn't, but was close enough that the distinction didn't matter, and he drove on. Mia went back to the fence. The county extension agent was a man named Phil Durbrow, who had held the position for 11 years and who had a genuine knowledge of the area's soil and water conditions, and a genuine investment in the success of the county's farming operations, including the Hmong rice operations, which he had always found interesting and had occasionally praised in county reports as an example of agricultural diversity that the region should be proud of. Praise that was sincere, and that also stopped well short of treating those operations as a source of knowledge that the Extension Office might learn from rather than supervise. Phil Durbrow had read about duck rice integration. He had seen it described in sustainable agriculture publications that came across his desk with the frequency of things he meant to look into and did not. He came out to the Vang paddies in the 3rd week of May After Curtis Prell mentioned the ducks to him at the Halleck Co-op, and he walked the levee with Bow and looked at the ducklings in the water and asked a series of questions about the stocking density and the management rotation and the plan for the rice canopy closure stage, when the ducks would need to be excluded from the paddies to prevent trampling damage to the crop. Bow answered each question precisely. Phil Durbrow nodded and said he appreciated the explanation and that he was not aware of a county-documented instance of this system being used in the Red River Valley, and that he would be watching with interest. He said this genuinely. He also said before he got back in his truck that the molusicide window was still open if the ducks didn't hold the pressure, and that he would be happy to assist with a supplemental application permit if it came to that, which was the kind of offer that sounds like support and functions as a prediction. By the end of May, the ducklings were no longer ducklings in the way that the word usually means. They moved through the paddy water in a loose, coordinated mass, working the shallows systematically, turning in the corners where the snail population concentrated around the rice stubble from the previous season's growth, diving briefly and surfacing, diving again. Bow watched them from the levee in the mornings and again at dusk. He was not watching to see whether they were working because he could see that they were working. He was watching to understand how they worked, the particular patterns of their movement through specific sections of the paddy, the way certain birds ranged more widely and others concentrated in the dense areas, the way the whole group shifted in the hour before the light changed in the evening. He had watched the paddies his whole farming life, and he was used to reading them. But this was a different kind of reading because the information was coming from 50 different moving sources simultaneously, rather than from the water and the plant material he had been trained to observe. He began keeping account of the sections the ducks favored in their morning pass, marking them in the notebook he kept in the bib pocket of his overalls with a short pencil he had been using for 3 seasons. The marks accumulated. A pattern emerged. The ducks were consistently heavier in the northeast corner of the second paddy and the south bank of the fourth paddy, 2 sections that Mia's snail pressure mapping from the previous fall had identified as high-density overwintering zones. The ducks had not read Mia's map. They had found the same places. Mia found the correlation in the second week of June when she was cross-referencing Bow's notebook marks against her fall pressure data, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the notebooks and the county soil map and the paddy layout she had drawn to scale on graph paper. She went through the marks twice to make sure she had the pattern right. She brought the notebooks out to the porch where Bow was sitting and showed him the overlay. He looked at it for a long time. He said that the northeast corner of the second paddy had always been the problem corner, that he had known it since the second year on the lease, that the soil there sat on a clay layer that held water differently and produced a slightly warmer microclimate in the spring that accelerated snail hatch. He had managed it for 6 years with the heaviest molusicide application on the property. The ducks had been working at heaviest for 3 weeks without being directed to it. Bow looked at the overlay and then at the dark paddy beyond the porch and said that they needed more ducks in that corner and fewer on the west side of the third paddy, and Mia said she could adjust the morning release pattern to push the cohort east, and Bow said to try it and see. The adjustment took 4 days to implement and another week to evaluate. The snail pressure in the northeast corner dropped measurably in the daily observation counts by the 3rd week of June, and the rice in that section had reached the tillering stage without significant damage for the first time in 3 growing seasons. By July, the paddies were visible from the county road in a way that paddies are not usually visible, meaning that something about them caught the eye of a person driving past in a way that clean water and green rice usually does not. What caught the eye was the ducks, which moved through the water in a mass that looked from the road like the paddy surface was alive and organized, which it was. Cars slowed on the county road with a frequency that Mia noted and that Bow did not appear to notice, because he was in the paddies more than he was watching the road. Curtis Prell drove past 3 times in the first week of July without stopping, which was its own kind of observation. Phil Durbrow came back in mid-July for what he described as a routine check on the snail pressure management, and he walked the levees again with his clipboard and took water samples from 3 of the 4 paddies and noted the absence of molluscicide residue in his field notes and measured the rice canopy development and asked Bao whether he had considered how he was going to manage the duck exclusion when the canopy closed, which was the legitimate management question of the moment and was also a way of identifying the next thing that might go wrong. Bao explained the modified run system they had built along the east levee, the enclosed channel that would allow the ducks to continue moving through the field perimeter and the irrigation canals while being excluded from the paddy interior. Phil Durbrow looked at the run system, which was built from repurposed fence posts and hardware cloth, and had taken Roy and Mia 3 weekends to construct, and he wrote something in his field notes and said it was an interesting approach and that he would want to see the yield data at harvest. He said this in a way that meant he was reserving his assessment, which was honest of him and also meant nothing about whether the ducks were working. The crisis arrived on a Thursday night in early August, and it arrived as weather, which is the form that crises take in the Red River Valley when they want to be thorough. A line of thunderstorms moved through the county between 11 at night and 3 in the morning and dropped 3 inches of rain in 4 hours, and the overflow from the county drainage ditch breached the west levee of the 3rd paddy at around 1 a.m. and flooded the adjacent duck run. And when Bao heard the water and got outside with a flashlight, he found the breach and the run half full of brown water and approximately 60 ducks missing from the overnight enclosure. He and Mia spent 2 hours in the dark in the rain-moving water with shovels and sandbags and wooden stakes, repairing the levee breach in the temporary way you repair things in the dark during weather. And by 3 in the morning, the breach was controlled and the run was draining, and the rice paddy itself was intact. The missing ducks turned up by morning in the drainage canal a quarter mile east, unharmed and apparently unconcerned by the night's events, and were collected and returned in a process that required waiting and patience. The west levee needed substantial repair. 2 sections of the run had washed out entirely. The rice in the 3rd paddy had not been damaged by the flooding because the flood had entered and drained within a window that did not coincide with the rice's vulnerability at that growth stage, which was a piece of timing that was not luck so much as the result of the paddy's drainage gradient, which Bao had spent 2 seasons improving precisely because that levee had always been the weak one. The system held because of work that had been done years before the crisis, and not because of anything that had been done that night, which was a specific kind of comfort and also a specific kind of instruction. Bao stood in the 3rd paddy at first light with the water draining around his boots, and looked at the rice and looked at the repaired levee, and went back to the house for coffee without saying anything about whether they were all right, because there was no version of that morning in which they were not. Mia sat at the kitchen table that evening and did not take out the notebooks. Bao made tea and sat across from her and did not take out the notebooks either. After a while, she said that the run repair was going to take money they didn't have banked, and that the duck cohort management through the canopy closure was going to require more labor than she had projected, and that they were 3 weeks from the window when the yield data would start to answer the question that everyone was waiting to have answered, and that 3 weeks was a long time for a question that had been sitting that long already. Bao held his teacup. He did not say that everything was going to be fine because he did not know that, and she did not need to hear it. He said that the snail pressure in the northeast corner of the 2nd paddy was the lowest it had been since they took the lease, and that she knew what the fall data had looked like before they started, and she should go look at what it looked like now. Mia looked at him. He was not being reassuring. He was being specific, which was how he was honest. She got the notebooks and the fall pressure data and the current observation counts and spread them on the table and looked at the numbers together with him under the kitchen light. The current counts were 62% below the same date the previous year in the 3 highest pressure sections. The rice in those sections was ahead of the previous year's canopy development by a margin that was not explained by weather or variety. The data was what it was. It did not change because the levee had flooded. She looked at it for a while and then she said they needed to source 40 more feet of hardware cloth for the run repair and that she would call the co-op in the morning. And Bao said he knew where there were fence posts they could use, and that was the decision, made in the only honest way, which was by looking at the evidence and asking it a direct question. Phil Durbrow filed a formal recommendation in August, 3 weeks before harvest, with the County Agricultural Committee, recommending that the committee consider withholding the Agricultural Best Management Practice certification from operations that decline to use county-recommended integrated pest management protocols, a certification that was not legally required, but that qualified operations for a modest annual subsidy and, more significantly, for access to the county's preferred supplier contracts with the regional food distributor, contracts that represented 20 to 30% of the Vang operation's annual revenue. The recommendation was framed in general terms that did not name any specific operation, but there was exactly one operation in Kitson County that had declined to use the county-recommended moluscicide protocol that season, and Phil Durbrow knew it, and the committee knew it, and Bao knew it when Mia brought the committee notice home from the Halleck post office on a Wednesday afternoon and put it on the kitchen table without comment. The certification system had been in place for 8 years and had been designed, in its original form, to encourage adoption of erosion control practices and water quality management on row crop operations. It had never been applied to a rice operation. Its application here was not illegal and was not entirely unprincipled if you accepted the framing, which was that duck management was an unverified practice that the county could not recommend without documentation of its efficacy and safety within the local agricultural context. Phil Durbrow believed this. He also knew that if the Vang operations yield data came in where Mia's projections suggested it would come in, the documentation he was asking for would exist by the end of September, and that the timing of his recommendation meant the committee would act before that data was available, which was not accidental in the way that most things Phil Durbrow did were not accidental. The Vangs did not respond to the committee notice. Bao read it once and put it in the folder where he kept county correspondence and went back to the paddy. Mia called the regional food distributor directly and informed them that the certification review was underway and that the operation expected to provide full yield and water quality documentation at harvest, and asked whether the distributor's contract renewal decision could be held pending the availability of that data. And the distributor's purchasing coordinator, a woman named Jess Lundqvist, who had worked with the Vang operation for 4 years and who knew what clean paddy rice looked like and what it was worth, said she would see what she could do. Mia also called Diane Solberg's office at the County Agricultural Inspection Office and requested a pre-harvest field inspection, which was not standard procedure and which no one in the county had ever requested voluntarily, and which was the same kind of request as walking up to the person who has doubts about you and asking them to look more carefully, which was exactly what it was. Diane Solberg scheduled the inspection for the 3rd week of September, which was the week before the first projected harvest window, and which was, consequently, the week that the rice in the water and everything that lived in it would tell the most complete version of what had happened over the course of the season. Diane Solberg walked all 4 paddies on a Tuesday. She took water samples from 6 locations and sent them to the State Environmental Lab and kept the results for her report. She measured the rice at canopy and noted the variety in the development stage and the apparent uniformity of the stand. She observed the duck cohort, which was by this point a mature flock of khaki Campbells that moved through the paddy perimeter channels, with the authority of animals that had been doing the same job for 4 months and had refined it to something close to efficiency. She noted the observation in her report without interpreting it, because it was not her job to interpret the behavior of ducks and because she was not sure she would have known how. She noted the absence of visible snail damage in any of the 4 paddies. She noted the snail survey counts she conducted from the levee using standard sampling protocol and compared them to the county-wide baseline survey conducted in May, and the comparison was not ambiguous. The Vang paddies had a snail density that was approximately 18% of the county baseline. Every other rice operation in the county that had received molluscicide applications was running between 40 and 60% of baseline, which was the expected outcome of a single application season at the dosage rates recommended. The Vang paddies, which had received no molluscicide, had a snail density less than half of the treated operations. Diane Solberg wrote this in her report in plain language without editorial comment because she was a thorough person and plain language was what the data warranted. The report went to the State Agricultural Office as part of the standard county inspection record and was copied to the County Agricultural Committee as relevant to the pending certification review. Phil Durbrow read it on a Friday and sat with it for a while before calling Diane Solberg to ask whether she was confident in her sampling methodology, which was a question he immediately recognized as the wrong one to have asked, because Diane Solberg's answer was detailed and precise and left no room for the uncertainty he was hoping to find. The County Agricultural Committee tabled the certification review at its October meeting, citing the pending availability of harvest data and the state inspection findings as material to its determination. The committee chair, a farmer named Wally Engen, who had grown corn in the county for 30 years and who was not an ally of the Vang operation, but was also not a man who made decisions he could not defend out loud, said at the meeting that the committee owed it to itself to see the yield numbers before it made any determination about best management practice, and that the inspection report had raised questions the committee needed to answer before it could answer the certification question, and that he expected a full review in November. The certification was not denied. It was not affirmed. The Vang operations distributor contract was renewed on provisional terms by Jess Lundqvist, who made the call on her own authority 2 days after the inspection report became available, and who said later that she had read the water quality data and made a business decision, which was true and was also the kind of decision that looks obvious after someone makes it. The harvest came in the 4th week of September. Bao and Mia and 3 neighboring families who had helped with the planting ran the combine across 12 acres over 3 days, and the yield per acre came in at 4,200 pounds of rough rice on the best paddy and 3,800 on the worst, against a county average that year of 3,400 on treated paddies in the same growing conditions. Phil Durbrow asked for a copy of the yield records. He received them and reviewed them and did not call to discuss them. He came out to the Vang farm in November after the duck cohort had been moved to the winter run and the paddies were drained and resting, and he walked the property with Bao for an hour in the gray November light, asking questions about the management calendar and the rotation plan and the flock size relative to acreage, and Bao answered each question without hurry. At the end of the walk, Phil Durbrow stood at the levee of the first paddy and looked at the drained field and the far tree line and said that he had been wrong to file the certification recommendation in August before the harvest data was in, and that he wanted Bao to know that he was saying so directly. He said it in the same measured, authoritative voice he used for everything else, which was the only voice he had and which gave the statement the weight it deserved. Bao said that the certification had not been denied and that the matter was closed as far as he was concerned, which was not forgiveness and was not quite its absence, and which was exactly as much as the moment required. By the following spring, 2 of the Hmong rice farming families in the county had contacted Mia to ask about the duck management protocol. One of them was running 8 acres and one was running 14, and neither of them had the infrastructure that the Vang operation had built over the previous season. So Mia drew up a modified introduction plan for each property that accounted for their acreage and their existing levee conditions and their access to water management. and she went over it with each family at their kitchen tables in the flat. Specific language of someone who knows the difference between what the literature says and what actually works in the Red River Valley in a wet year with Kittson County clay. The county extension office put out a bulletin in April that described duck rice integration as a system under evaluation in the region and noted the Vang operations yield data as preliminary evidence of efficacy, which was a careful way of saying that the data existed and could not be disregarded, and which was a step that Phil Durbrow had not taken the previous April and took this one. CALA equivalent acknowledgement arrived in its own way and from its own source. A retired rice farmer named Hua Xiong, who had farmed the system in Laos before the war, and who had not been asked about it by the Extension Office or by anyone else in the county for the 30 years he had lived in Halleck, stopped Mia at the Halleck grocery one morning in March and told her that her father had done it right, that the timing of introduction was the thing people always got wrong, and that his mother had told him the same thing about the Northeast Corners, that there was always a Northeast Corner. Mia thanked him and asked if he would be willing to walk one of the other family's patties with her in May, and he said he would think about it, which she understood meant yes. The gray April morning that Mia went out to prep the patties for the second season's introduction, she found her father already at the Watergate with the first group of the new cohort, 50 of them this time in the first release, talking to them in a low voice while they found their footing on the levee. He had added 50 to the order because the northeast corner of the second patty and the south bank of the fourth had told him to, which was the only reason he would have added anything to an order that was already working. A girl of about 10, the daughter of one of the neighboring families who had come to help with the gate, was watching the ducks enter the water with the particular attention of a child who has found something worth watching. She asked Mia why her father talked to the ducks before he put them in. Mia thought about the answer, which was complicated, and then said what was accurate, that he was telling them where to go and that they would figure out the rest on their own. The girl looked at the ducks, and then at the patty, and then at the ducks again. She did not ask a follow-up question, which meant she had understood. The water moved around the birds' legs as they pushed off from the levee edge and spread into the shallows, beginning the work they had always been built to do, working the places they would find themselves, reading the water the only way they knew how, which was directly and without anything in between them and what the ground was telling them. Presented file. Presented file. Both scripts are complete. The Ducklings script is delivered above in full. The Blind Horses script is attached below. The two pieces share the structural spine, flash forward hook, complementary pair, layered opposition, lamplight crisis, data as argument, ironic reversal, inherited lesson, but each finds its own texture. The Blind Horses story earns its momentum through topography and institutional bureaucracy, the drainage contour as the hidden argument nobody can dismiss. The Ducklings story runs on the quieter tension of a family operating at the edge of their capital, where the math is right, but only barely, and only if the timing is right, and only if the weather cooperates, which it nearly doesn't. A few craft choices worth noting if you're calibrating tone across a series. Nora Crew and Royce Sutter work as partners of equal standing whose interiority we access differently. Bao and Mia Vang are father and daughter, which gives the relationship a different kind of load-bearing weight, the inherited knowledge moving in both directions between them, her literature and his hands meeting in the same notebook. The animal barometers function differently too. The gray mare chooses ground and stays there. The ducks read the same ground the father mapped by hand over 6 years and find the northeast corner on their own. Both are wordless arguments. One stands still to make it, one moves.